All right. Welcome everyone to the last episode of the year for the webinar series Scrubbing the Skies of American University's Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns. I'm co-director of the Institute. Now, unless you've been living under a rock the last couple of weeks, you know that there was a major climate conference, right? The 28th Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And probably the marquee headline from that event was the commitment by parties to quote unquote transition from fossil fuels. But obviously, there were lots of other important developments at this meeting, including in the context of carbon dioxide removal. And since that's what we do, that's what we'll focus on today. And we're going to do this in a roundtable format, leaving ample time for questions for from the audience, however, at the end. And so I encourage you throughout the initial segment to start populating the Q&A box with your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We have an excellent panel to discuss these issues, and so I'd like to initially introduce them, and then we'll get into to some initial questions. Gabrielle Walker is founder of Rethinking Removals. Katie Lebling is an associate in the Carbon Removal and Industrial Decarbonization Program at the World Resources Institute. Ben Rubin serves as executive director and co-founder of the Carbon Business Council. And then finally, Ted Parson is faculty director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the Law School at UCLA. So thank you for all of you for joining us, and let's get right into it. So let's start broad, and then we'll drill down. So I'd like to ask everybody at the outset, and beginning with Gabrielle, to give me your general impressions of how carbon dioxide removal was taken up at the at COP28.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks for the invitation to be on this webinar with this very esteemed panel. I think that my biggest headline at COP28 was just a dramatic difference from COP26. So you mentioned that I'm co-founder of Rethinking Removals. That's an organization that was actually born in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow with a specific aim of trying desperately to get carbon dioxide talked about in some way, on the agenda in some way at that COP. And by the way, I'm also co-founder of another organization, Curate, which is a market maker in this space. Anyway, so we were founded in the run-up to COP26. It was exhausting trying to get anybody thinking about this. The UNFCCC didn't have it anywhere near the agenda. There were maybe 5 or 6 events, all of which we put on. It was really kind of pushing water uphill. At this COP28, I was very happy to be co-leading along with Ben and the Carbon Business Council, carbon removals at COP, the second incarnation of this. And this was an attempt to corral all the things that were happening, all the ways that carbon removals are being talked about. And from like 5 or 6 events in COP26 2 years ago, there were more than 75. And many of them curated by lots of the people who collaborate with us on this panel. So just 75 events, lots of them in high-level places, lots of them in contexts that weren't just kind of some people, nerdy people talking on the side, but were actually at the heart of the matter when it came to climate change. So I think it's an accelerating, dramatically accelerating level of attention, which is, of course, exactly what we need. So I think that's one comment that really struck me. The other thing, and we might come to this a bit more later, and other people have comments about this as well. I was mortally afraid, to be honest, before going to COP28. I thought that carbon removals risked getting caught in the crossfire between the increasing kind of fury over fossil fuel companies and what they were doing and whether they were real about climate, and if this COP had been co-opted. And then also what the fossil fuel companies were saying, don't worry, we'll remove it later. So I was really worried that this was going to be caught in that crossfire, and it wasn't. And I've got some thoughts about why that wasn't, but why it didn't happen. But you know, those are my 2 headlines, talked about so much more and not caught in that deadly crossfire.
All right, thanks for that, Gabrielle. Let's go to you, Ted.
Thanks, Will, and thanks again for the invitation to join. So I have a perspective that I think it's distinct from Gabrielle's, but is not in disagreement. So um, I think the way you characterize the intense level of activity and the innovation, the constructiveness of the debate, it absolutely characterizes everything that was going on outside the wall. Inside the wall, meaning inside where the texts were being negotiated, it was very strange. I mean, carbon dioxide removal is so fundamental to all the assumptions, all the scenarios and trajectories that are being discussed in terms of possible ways of even coming close to the Paris targets, um, and at an extraordinarily expanded scale. And yet you're hard pressed to find any sensible discussion and certainly any explicit reference to text. So just a couple of examples. I was really struck in the outcome text. I mean, the failure of the Article 6 negotiations, but even in the Global Stocktake text, by the extent to which every time the content comes toward the carbon removal space, it diverts a little bit to use as the single example carbon capture and utilization. And which of course is also an important avenue of reduction of net emissions that needs to be expanded, encouraged, and with appropriate governance and so on, but likely to be much smaller than the scale at which removals are needed. And although large-scale removals are consistent with the founding texts, I mean, reducing emissions and enhanced removals, it's striking the degree to which the discussion avoids, the diplomatic discussion avoids explicit consideration of the scale of need and the associated issues. And I find quite a stark disparity between that and what I really agree is the vigorous, innovative, very exciting level of activity occurring in all the side events and out in the green zone.
All right, thanks for that, Ted. And we're going to get back to that question about the language in the stock take very soon. But I'll go next to Katie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I definitely echo the comments that were made already. I think definitely from the perspective of someone who was not up in the negotiations, there were a huge amount of side events. There was a lot of conversation about carbon dioxide removal. And I think there was a lot of interest, not just in like direct air capture, but a huge range of approaches, and with a range of different groups working on them, and a huge diversity in the geographies that are interested as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. I think the role of the Global South and scaling up CDR came up a fair amount in these side event conversations, and the opportunity that presents. I think one thing kind of adjacent to the comments that have been made already, I think one thing that I noticed is there is still confusion about the differences between CCS and CDR. What their actual differences are on like a technological level. And there is some crossover there, which I think does fuel that confusion, but more in terms of like what their roles are in a climate action portfolio. I think there is sometimes confusion, but also sometimes intentional conflation. And so I think like terminology like carbon management, I think can exacerbate this. But I think that's one thing that I noticed that still needs to be worked on in this space. And I think this confusion also leads to some of the criticism that continues around CDR. And so I guess one way that we as WRI were trying to show up at this COP was addressing that through our work on governance gaps around CDR. So we had a few events looking at practical recommendations to address those gaps through things like setting separate targets, defining residual emissions, et cetera, which I can talk more about later. But I just wanted to add that piece in. But I think overall, greatly increasing interest level, which is great, around the importance of CDR and its role in achieving our climate goals.
All right, thanks for that, Katie. And finally, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will, for organizing this webinar. Great to be here with the co-panelists, and appreciate everybody who's tuned in today to join us for this discussion on COP right before the holidays. It's been all great comments from the co-panelists here about the different key takeaways from COP. I think one or two things I guess that I would layer in with is I think this growing conversation about carbon removal, and it was a significant growth in the conversation to Gabrielle's point, and to a point Ted made too, the significance of carbon removal making it a global stocktake. It was accompanied by so many different folks being on the ground at COP. It was exciting. The Carbon Business Council had more than 20 companies there at different events. There was just so many folks who were there activating around carbon removal, but we also saw an upwelling of activity for folks around the world as well. We can unpack some of it during the discussion, but we saw new reports released that are going to be really good seminal resources throughout 2024, like the Roads to Removal report. We saw new purchasing announcements made. And so I think COP is this convening force to unlock the additional things that it did in the space beyond what was actually on the ground in Dubai. Will continue to reverberate for us as we go into the new year. And maybe just one additional thought on the significance of removals that we talked about. I know so much of the discussion is going to focus on carbon removal today as our focus for the webinar, but I think another thing that really, to me, started to solidify and emerge at COP is how carbon removal does stand as a distinct pillar of climate action alongside emissions reductions and alongside the work of resiliency and preparing for the impacts of climate change. So it's just promising across the board to see progress made on the field on the emissions reductions front, progress on resiliency, and progress in removals. We'll be diving deeper into the progress that was made on removals in particular, but definitely some notable highlights on these additional pillars of climate action as well. Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks again, Will.
All right, thank you, Ben. I guess lawyers think alike, and so Ted kind of teed up the next question. I too am curious what people think about what I see as a bit of a disconnect between a kind of a fulsome commitment to carbon removal as opposed to CCS. So I'm going to start off with Katie on this one. So the Global Stocktake has several provisions that arguably are pertinent to carbon removal and its role in terms of addressing Paris, including, I think, probably the front line language is a call to accelerate, quote, zero and low emissions technologies, which includes removal technologies such as carbon capture and utilization and storage. Do you think this language substantially advances the carbon removal agenda under Paris, or were the parties confused and they conflated it with CCS, or they really are only committed to CCS at this point? What do you think from that language and other language, if you want, in the Stocktake agreement?
Yeah, so I'll add a few comments of my interpretation, but curious what others think as well. So I think just pulling back a little bit, I know we mentioned already, and people have probably seen this in the news a lot because it was the #1 kind of discussion item here, but around the transition away from fossil fuels. And so the piece that you're mentioning, I think, fits under that kind of menu or list of options for what needs to be done to achieve deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gases in line with the 1.5 pathway. And so under that are many different emissions reductions and mitigation options, like the tripling of renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency improvements, which was also a separate commitment that got integrated. And then there's the headline, transitioning away from fossil fuel and energy systems in a just, orderly, equitable manner, et cetera. And then there's that kind of subparagraph that you mentioned that does mention removal technologies. So accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including renewables, nuclear, abatement, and removal technologies, such as carbon capture and utilization and storage, particularly in hard to abate sectors. So I guess my interpretation, I think, top line, it's great that the fossil fuel language ended up in there. It's great that 1.5 C pathways is mentioned. And it's interesting that it turned out with this transition away rather than the phase down, phase out, which was in the arguments running up to the COP. But on your actual question on the removal, the mention of removal technologies, I think the way that it is framed, I read it as carbon capture is one option for the abatement. Just the way that it's written, I don't think that was actually an example of removal technologies, but I think it is written in such a confusing way, and I think that obviously, yeah, contributes to this confusion. All these different options, such as renewables, nuclear, removal technologies, they're all kind of intermingled. So you kind of lose the sense of which are the most important, or which should play the biggest role, arguably shifting to renewables. And also it obscures the difference between emissions reduction and removals. So it kind of muddles their roles there. So I think it could for sure be improved. But I think it is also great that it is included at all. So I think it's kind of a matter of interpretation in that sense. And I think it's also better than earlier versions, which we don't have to dwell on, but I think there were earlier versions that mentioned substituting of unabated fossil fuels, which removals are not really meant for. And it was presented more as a menu of options, whereas this formulation calls on parties to contribute. So it's really asking them to do as much as they can along these lines. But I mean, my interpretation is that it is kind of the result of compromise, and like you can kind of see in some of the options above, there's accelerating efforts toward the phase down of unabated coal power and accelerating efforts toward net zero emission energy systems. So there's kind of different formulations of saying somewhat similar things, so people can kind of latch on to what they think is most beneficial or favorable to them and their national circumstances. But I will stop there and let others chime in.
Okay, Ted, I saw you wanted to jump in, and then Gabrielle.
Okay, I'm going to do a little self-censoring here. The first thing I want to say is it's wonderful to work in a field where I'm surrounded by optimists like Gabrielle and Katie. It just makes me feel good every day. And I don't mean to suggest that the interpretations that either one of you have given are improperly or excessively, optimistic. But and here's why I want to invite my co-panelists to talk me down off a conspiracy theory ledge here. So my reading of this text is that it's not an accident that there is continued confounding of CCS and CDR, and that to the extent that there is a prioritization of one over the other, it tends to favor CCS rather than CDR. I think of that now, will you? I said talk me down off the conspiracy ledge, but it's also talk me back from thinking about analogies to the solar geoengineering stuff that I work on most of the time, the fourth pillar to be added to the three that been summarized. As on that issue, my guess here is that the language emerges as a compromise between the fossil interests that were so dominant at the COP, they are adjusting their self-understanding. They understand they won't be pumping oil forever, but what they're doing now is trying very hard each to be the one who pumps the last barrel, and to make sure that that last barrel is pumped in 2070 or 2080 or 2090 as opposed to 2040 or 2050 or 2060. So them on the one side, and the sort of the symbolically dominated sort of green, perspective on the other side that doesn't want to talk about practical alternatives that might make a huge difference in reducing climate change risks, but actually pose hard choices themselves. So CDR expanding to gigaton or tens of gigaton scale over a few decades, it's huge, it's important, it's valuable, and it will pose a lot of hard choices. So the continued prioritization of CCS, which is sort of smaller in scale, more directly connected to current emission sources, and by both of those attributes doesn't raise the sort of the profound questions of allocation of risk across place and over time, or the policy questions that envisioning the scale of CDR required to come toward Paris scenarios, I see as consistent with that sort of longstanding, it's like, back to lawyer analogies, it's like we have the plaintiff, we have the defendant, they both have things they want to say, but there are important things that need to be said that neither of them wants to say, and we're not really saying them clearly and loudly enough. And note, I'm only talking here about the text inside the room. I'm in no way sort of diminishing the extraordinary excitement and activity and innovativeness going on all around the outside, but the text matter too. Okay, so talk me down off that conspiracy ledge.
Okay,
Gabriel,
so step one, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, Ted, please don't put me in a box marked optimist, especially not before you've even heard what I have to say commenting on this text. So I'm not sure I'm going to I'm not sure I'm going to talk you down from this ledge. I'm probably going to agree with you, but and I think the same applies to Katie. I think she gave an extremely measured and sensible description of exactly what was there in the text, and not some kind of foolish optimist at the moment. We might get foolish later. Anyway, so to move on, I think I agree with you. That's the other thing. That's the reason I wanted to make that point. because if we're talking about the text inside the rooms, it's constantly astonishing to me. If you look at COP26, the race to zero was everywhere. There's been this massive explosion in net zero commitments. And of course, carbon removals are a very essential part of that. And yet, not only was it not on the agenda, but nobody was even putting the words carbon and removals next to each other. And so it is astonishing that so many people who really ought to be able to look at the numbers and understand what they're doing have not been paying attention. And it cannot be coincidence. So I think one part of this, and I spent a lot of work on carbon capture and storage before I went into carbon removals, where it's essential and why it isn't being feted. And the biggest issue around CCS is a complete lack of trust based on the assumption that fossil fuel companies are saying, we will do that, and that will keep our fossil fuels in play, and therefore don't worry your pretty little heads, which is something that drives activists, particularly Matt, they don't like being patronized any more than any of us do. So I think you're right. I think that this is very deliberate. I think every comma and every placing and every word placing in this has been done on purpose. I think it's hugely interesting to look at the version before the one that was actually adopted. I was fascinated by that, because the version before said something, it looks kind of similar if you're not really paying attention. It says, accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including inter alia renewables, nuclear, abatement and removal technologies, comma, including such as carbon capture and utilization and storage. In the next version, it said removal technologies such as carbon capture and utilization and storage. So the comma had gone and the such as had gone. And every comma and every set of words is actually weighed. Now, I agree with you, Katie, it can be read as abatement and removal technologies such as. It could be referring to abatement, but it's next to removals, and they don't do things by accident. So I think this is actually, it's a compromise, allowing the fossil fuels guys who are still being horrified that the words fossil fuels were being put in there, were being horrified that this was calls on instead of just something you might want to do, who are insisting on it, because they see CCS as a ticket out of jail, relatively free. I don't think they're right, but that's the way they're seeing it. So I agree. I do think that's what was going on. And I think that it's very interesting. When I said at the beginning that the removals didn't get caught in that crossfire, as I thought they would do, there's still enough confusion about the difference between CCS and carbon removals to allow them to be conflated like this. So there's plenty of people who don't understand, but I don't think that's what was going on here. But also, when there was the first of all, the call for fossil fuel phase out, and then there was the next version that said nothing at all about fossil fuels and caused an uproar, there was immediately this big scramble. There's all of us that were there will remember it. There were letters flying around the place. There was calls to action. There were, what do we do to put the pressure on? And there was a science letter that went out from a bunch of scientists saying, phase out is scientific. When there was a scandal about Al-Jaber apparently saying phase out isn't scientific. And what I think was really significant was that scientific letter that went out said, phase out is essential, and so are carbon removal technologies. So, and that wasn't a coincidence either. A lot of us have been doing a lot of work to make sure that removals weren't pegged on to the same place that CCS was. So I think that is what's happening in the text. I think that the pressure on the outside stopped it being seen as that. But I don't really quite understand why so many governments are so keen on pushing the CCS part of it, and I don't think it's going to last. And the final point I'd make about this text, which I think is brilliant, so this is me being an optimist maybe, is that when something gets written into a text for the UNFCCC process, however it's written in, it becomes a leverage point. It becomes something you can crowbar. And until this point, it hasn't been anywhere. So I think I was really frustrated to see that conflation with CCS. I was frustrated with the way that even CCS is being associated with keeping fossil fuels in play, when in fact it's an essential technology and we need it for hard to abate sectors. But I was thrilled that we now have that crack to get our crowbar in and to start to get more leverage around this in the negotiations.
Thanks for that, Gabrielle. Yeah, I'd note that the mitigation work program decision, right, probably is not helpful either, because its references to CCUS. And
yeah.
So, Ben, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great discussion so far. I think the discussion has rightfully been focused on this. What are the implications of the proximity of carbon removal and CCS appearing alongside each other in the text? But I also want to lift up and affirm that final point that Gabrielle just made. I think the significance of carbon removal making it into the text at all is a very significant inflection point. If we think about the catalyzing impact that the IPCC report had when that came out in 2018, affirming the fact that we need gigatons of carbon removal to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and how rapidly carbon removal has scaled up since that's happened, having carbon removal in the global stocktake, the affirmation that carbon removal is needed, that 198 countries have agreed that carbon removal is needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, really significant, along with everything else that's in the global stocktake. Carbon removal appears alongside this call for zero and low carbon technologies. And so it's under a larger umbrella that carbon removal is a basket approach with a lot of else of what's out there, along with reducing emissions. So I just wanted to bring up, I guess, this point that Gabrielle was making, that I think just the significance of it being in there at all. And then maybe one clarification as well, as we're talking about the IPCC report, which I think might come up to bear in the future, is that the IPCC in their report does look at carbon removal and carbon capture as two distinct pathways. CCS is not linked in with carbon removal in the report. So although we see the proximity of the two in the global stocktake, we ultimately have the scientific body to I think go back to as a demarcation line, that these two are in fact distinct, as 2 points I would make around implications of the global stocktake.
Okay. Now, another topic for which carbon removal was directly pertinent and extremely contentious prior to COP28 and during COP28 was the role of carbon removals, if any, in Article 6, right, which provides for carbon credit markets, including Article 6.4, which would establish a structure under Paris to facilitate trading in credits, facilitated by, among other things, carbon removal. Ultimately, the parties were not able to finalize rules either associated with 6.2 or 6.4. And I was wondering if anybody on the panel had any insights into what happened in that context, including in terms of carbon removal issues. Gabrielle, you look like you might.
I can have a quick go. I wasn't actually in those negotiations, so anything I can say is secondhand, but is good source secondhand. It was very frustrating. It really felt like it was going to go through. There'd been so much hard work done by the supervisory body during the year. And there are different kind of theories out there, including from people who were in the room at the time. So IETA was certainly said that they felt like the whole carbon markets issue had been so politicized at COP that there is this very strong body of opinion that says any market mechanisms, any carbon market is an abomination, shouldn't be supported. And so that's one of the things that put extra pressure on trying to get these rules sorted out. But then there's also apparently there was a bit of a split between certain regions, including the European Union, that really wanted to hold out for quite strong regulations, and other territories, including the United States, that was sort of saying, let's just make it as easy as possible for everyone to participate. And I think very much with the collapsing voluntary carbon market in mind, there was quite the fear that letting go of any of those principles could be really disastrous. So that's another fault line that emerged. And then I think that the final thing I'd say about this is that there is still an underlying and I think a danger as well in separating out carbon removals from other technologies or other climate approaches rather than including them. There was a point where in throwing the toys out of the pram, there was even a suggestion made that carbon removal should be taken out of Article 6.4 completely. So although the rules weren't agreed, at least bad rules weren't agreed. So I think that's a bit of a relief. But I think it's there's also a need to really converse with, engage with, and I think to some extent educate a lot of the people who are doing the negotiations, who I think didn't really understand how ready the world is for this market, what the state of play actually is. They're still behaving and thinking of it as if it's something that's a kind of pie in the sky or would need to be built in some really material way, whereas there's plenty of governments out there that are raring to go. And I think that I heard that some people who'd actually been involved in the supervisory body and been quite supportive, as soon as they became negotiators, they put a different hat on and turned into different people and actually became big challenges. And so I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but it was disappointing, and it does put extra pressure on the voluntary carbon market to deliver volumes while we're still waiting for this to come into play.
Okay. Other thoughts in that context?
I can just add one or two thoughts. I also was not in the negotiations for this, so my information is also secondhand. But I think part of this was also, or part of the challenges around 6.4 came from the lack of consensus around the rules for reporting in 6.2. So 6.2 is already operationalized. That's bilateral cooperation, market-based cooperation. And so that can still continue without this agreement, but I think the disagreement around the level of information that countries need to share transparently or that they can designate as confidential was one issue of dispute with the kind of regional differences that Gabrielle mentioned. So I think that lack of decision on 6.2 made it harder to make progress on 6.4 because I believe they had to be passed as a package. And so there were also additional sticking points, of course, on 6.4 around the removals guidance and whether that was strong enough or too many pieces were open to interpretation still. I guess the other thing just that I would mention is I think there was actually a deal on 6.8, which is the non-market cooperation piece of Article 6, so cooperation on like capacity building and other non-market approaches. And so I think that's also just one positive thing to keep in mind. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Anything, Ben and Ted, in this context? Ben?
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, great points from Gabrielle and Katie. I think I just wanted to underscore a point that Katie made, which is, both to look at 6.8, which has become operationalized and passed, and I think gives a leverage point, and there'll be more follow-ups there. And then also that 6.2 is operational now. So government to government cooperation around carbon removal can continue, although it wasn't formally passed. But then also, this is partly a look, I think, at what happened at COP28, but also inevitably a look ahead to what to expect at COP29. And I think what this means is over the runway of 2024, expect to see more conversations around getting into the details of 6.4 and everybody on the webinar tuning in, having an opportunity to weigh in on public comment periods and have a say in what it's going to look like. The conversation was started last year at COP27 about 6.4, and it was a broad outline then. We were encouraged with how it was filled in over the course of this year, that the current state of 6.4 was taking a largely tech-neutral approach and encouraging multiple forms of removal to scale. Didn't make it into COP28 to be formally ratified, but again, more opportunities ahead for engagement as we go into COP29, and I do think with 6.2 and 6.8, some immediate and tangible things that carbon removal folks can tap into in the near term.
Just
go ahead, Gabriel.
Quick comment, if I may. I just noticed a couple of questions directly about Article 6 in the Q&A, just about that bit of the discussion. And one question was, what about the content of the information note on Article 6.4 that the Supervisory Board put out in the spring? I wanted to comment on this. I nearly said something about it before. I mean, basically, that was a note that said nature-based removals good, tech removals bad, says the UNFCCC. I'm broadly paraphrasing, but that was actually, it wasn't put out by the Supervisory Board. It was put out as an information note by the Secretariat. And one of the things I think is interesting about that, it was actually traced, I believe, to one person who put that in, and the Supervisory Board hit the roof and said, "That's not what we think. That's not the way it is." And so, although it kind of stuck a little bit in the media, it didn't stick in the Supervisory Board. But it was an evidence of the dangers of taking carbon removals and putting them in a separate box marked separate technologies. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of having removals as a separate pillar alongside reduction and adaptation, because as far as I can tell, removals and reductions are both mitigation, which is already a pillar. So they're both contributing to mitigation. And I think the more we can actually show how carbon removals fit into the overall pattern, the less chance there is for this kind of thing to go wrong. So I just wanted to make that quick comment. And then the other one was, someone had asked, please expand on the collapsing voluntary carbon market, Gabriel's comment. I think what I'm referring to is the sudden dramatic rise in toxicity associated with carbon credits, bearing in mind that the vast majority of the voluntary carbon market is not carbon removals, but other forms of credit, and in very large amounts of them RED Plus. And RED Plus has obviously taken a very significant kicking this year, and a lot of corporates who had been buying have leapt away as if their hands have been burned, which indeed they kind of have. And so I think there's now a kind of renewed interest. There's a lot of attention at COP on getting integrity back into the carbon market 2.0, how we can get the standards, and Katie knows a lot more about this than I do, but I just wanted to answer that question with, it's not about collapsing in sales of carbon removals, it's about trust in the whole market itself and how that has to be restored.
So yeah, I'll come in on this, and I'm gonna defer to you, Will, because I'm raising some questions that might extend our discussion to this topic, because they're sort of things I'd love to hear my co-panelists come back on, and feel free to rule those out of order if you want to move on. So I, like my co-panelists, am reading the tea leaves from secondhand accounts by people who were in these rooms, and I have to say, I always find it striking when an informed observer's comment on an important decision in negotiation laments that it was politicized. Because I always wonder what that means. I mean, there are important substantive issues at stake in these negotiations on which people have different views, and reconciling or finding a common ground among those views is an inherently political process. Now, in particular, I would suggest 6.4 is the big ticket item in Article 6. 6.2 and 6.8 both show promising progress and could be pursued further. But if Article 6 is going to be a kind of a freight train, driving toward a climate 6, it's going to be mainly through the entity-to-entity transactions that Article 6.4 addressed to, not the nation-to-nation transactions and not the non-market ones. So it's really important. And the distinction between removals and reductions in those trades is also important, because removals present serious substantive issues that are distinct from those presented by exchange of reductions, principally security and longevity of the removals, depending upon where they're going, and the justice of distributive impacts at the sites of large removal projects. So you can frame this debate as being delusionally optimistic market supremacists against anti-market zealots, and express it entirely in ideological terms. You can also frame the same disagreement in terms of people who think that the specific provisions being issued now provide an adequate first step toward effective basis for confidence that removals engaged in these transactions will be sufficiently secure for sufficiently long and sufficiently vetted regarding their compatibility with sustainability at a sustainable development and justice at the point of site projects, and people who think that the protections are not that far along and need to be more explicit and further. Now, of course, the ideological differences are correlated with the different judgments about whether the specific provisions being negotiated are adequate or are adequate as a first step. So I guess the thing I'd love to hear my co-panelists address is, to what extent do you read the current discussions and the prospects for further advance as being ideological sympathy or hostility to markets on the one hand that sort of is unpromising for near-term progress, and to what extent do you read them as being sincere differences in opinions about whether the substantive protections being discussed are on the one hand adequate, and on the other hand not so unnecessarily burdensome as to stifle valuable activities of trading? And as I said, Will, it's a huge question, and you should feel free to say, Ted, that's out of order. We need to move on to the next topic. But if we can, I'd love to hear my more informed co-panelists dig into this one step further.
Yeah, it's both out of order and interesting. So let's do it. You want to start, Gabrielle?
Yeah, I can make a very short comment. I think the answer is both. And you know this. So the part of the point is, and also just I wanted to make the kind of slightly nitpicky point that Article 6.4, of course, isn't just about carbon removals. It's about making a market between governments, and so it's not just whether removals have the right conditions, it's whether everything does, and if you agree with all the different parts of it. So so that's one comment. But also, as you know very well, in these negotiations, there are plenty of people who are who are going in there with positions that they've been told to hold and who they don't necessarily hold themselves. There's plenty of people who are aware, or whose governments are aware that they're getting pressure from NGOs, and so the zealotry can come in, or there's and there's also plenty of people who are really looking at it and saying that's never going to work. We can't let it go through. It'd be better not to let it go through than to let something that's going to be so weak. And so I'm very sure that all of those things were coming into play in those negotiations, and that's one of the reasons that it was hard. I really, really hope that it's not going to continue like this, because, but you know, it's their job to get this over the line, and they had one job, and so, you know, we, as Ben said, we'll certainly be doing what we can, and I'm sure everyone on this call will be, to see how we can try and help in the intervening year. But who knows?
Katie or Ben? Any thoughts? Well, I had one then, Ted. Because I've been watching 6.4 for a while. I think it's a mixed bag too. I think Gabrielle's characterization of the kind of the initial incarnation of this being, you know, all nature-based solutions good, anything quote unquote industrial bad, right? Was a caricature, right? Because, you know, if you plant 900 million acres of forest, which were some of the initial proposals, right, in terms of afforestation, you'd have massive unsustainable implications, right? So that you can't make that kind of Manichaean choice. But
I think you can, if you're being ideological about it. You don't have to numbers
you,
to say
you can. I'm just saying you can't from a scientific perspective.
No. It wasn't talking science. I was talking ideology.
You know, but I think to the credit of the parties, you've seen an evolution, right? There was a lot of discussion initially of ton-year accounting in these documents, and more of a reality check as people have weighed in on this, and a lot more discussion of some of the quote unquote industrial roles having a place, and more granular discussion of MRV, right, than you would have ever possibly seen in the context of these negotiations, right? And so I think they're doing us a favor in some ways, because they're highlighting some of the really important issues and devoting some pretty thoughtful discussion, right? That hopefully will kick the can down the road. So my 2 cents. Anyway, so let's move on so we can get to some audience questions. Now, one thing that we were talking about a moment ago was the kind of catastrophic decline in voluntary carbon markets, largely led by what happened with South Pole and Red Plus projects. And one of the developments at the meeting was that the world's leading independent carbon crediting standards, including 2 that are heavily involved in carbon removal, Vera and Gold Standard, agreed to a number of measures that they argued would help, quote unquote, increase the transparency of consistency of carbon markets. Could you briefly discuss, Ben, what some of those measures are that are being designed to help try to bolster the integrity of the voluntary carbon markets?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I do think it's a good point about what trends we'll continue to see in the voluntary carbon market over 2024 in light of 6.4 not having been adopted. And I think this example that you brought up, Will, is a good example to show how some of the existing registries will be coordinating, collaborating in space to come up with a set of common principles. Probably the biggest one that I might call out here to elevate and demarcate is that the announcement includes that there's a demarcation in the announcement between removals credits and more traditional offset credits. And I think the fact that we're seeing a demarcation, it builds on an announcement that Vera made earlier in the year where they were starting to demarcate too. It's recognizing that we are talking about 2 distinct pathways here. Traditionally, offset credits can include everything from solar panels to really a broad spectrum. Removals credits have a distinct set of characteristics and needs. And so I think the fact that we saw Vera going that way and making an announcement about that earlier in 2023, and then we saw this once again affirmed at COP, it means that we're going to start to see developments on complementary but parallel tracks that markets are, I think, recognizing and affirming the fact that a removal credit is a distinct entity, and that will ultimately, I think, help to build up and shore up the carbon removal market. So was encouraged to see that demarcation point. There's more to unpack. There's more both in the grist of the announcement and then also reading the tea leaves about what it means and how this might feed into larger processes. But I'll stop there. Just wanted to make that point, which I think is an important one about this demarcation point about removal credits and offset credits.
Any other thoughts? Okay. All right, let's move on then. So another development during COP28 was an announcement by a group that denominates themselves the Group of Negative Emitters, or GONE, cleverly as an acronym, launched by Denmark, Finland, and Panama. And I was wondering, Katie, could you explain the objectives and contours of the agreement initially, and then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, so I think this was sort of a soft launch for this initiative. I think there's a lot to still be worked out in terms of exactly how it will operate and what signatories are committing to and on what time frame, all the kind of nitty-gritty questions. But I think the overall objective is to make it clear that obviously we want to get to net zero as soon as possible by 2050, ideally. But beyond that, we also need to achieve net negative emissions to address the increasing concentration of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And the only way to do that is with carbon removal. And so this group, led by Denmark, which has a commitment to 70% emissions reductions by 2030, net zero by 2045, and then net negative or 110% reductions by 2050. So they have this target already. Panama, one of the other signatories, is already net negative. And then Finland has a net zero target by 2035 and net negative by 2040 target. So they've already committed to this. And I think, I mean, I said there's a lot to still be worked out. I think my personal thoughts on how this could be leveraged is to have that headline commitment of reaching net negative, which is great, but then also within that, laying out what the role of carbon dioxide removal can and should be. And obviously, maybe this is getting to your follow-on question, but obviously Denmark, Finland, Panama, they all are different countries. They have different national circumstances, different resources, different levels of forest cover, different economic development levels, et cetera. So the way that they approach carbon removal is probably going to be different. So within this diverse group, which I'm guessing will probably grow over time, how should countries be thinking about using carbon dioxide removal as part of a broader portfolio of climate action to achieve the net negative commitment that they have? And then also within that, I mean, I think one of the criticisms you hear about net zero targets, you hear about CDR, is that that's all fine and good, but like how do we even get to net zero? What can we be doing today in 5 years, 10 years to get to that 2050 target? So within this broader commitment of net negative, what can be done to set intermediate targets 5 years out? And then what does CDR look like as a component of those intermediate targets? So that's my thoughts on that. But I think overall I think it's an interesting initiative. I think this was just a soft launch, as I understand. So I think there'll be more to come in terms of membership, as well as details on the components of it.
Yeah, Ted?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out one complementarity here. The GONE initiative is the first concrete announcement by emitting jurisdictions that is aligned with one of the several quite innovative, even radical recommendations in the September report of the Climate Overshoot Commission. The reporting on that tended to highlight their recommendations on solar geoengineering, but they had very interesting and cogent recommendations on mitigation and adaptation and finance as well. And on mitigation, I think, I invite my panelists to correct me, I think this was the first high-level body to point out that if you care both about serious reduction in net emissions to limit climate change risks aligned with the Paris targets, and about serious differentiation along north-south or developing lines, then one implication of that is that the industrialized countries have to not just get to net zero by mid-century, they need to get to net negative by mid-century, because that's the only way to allow room for development trajectories in middle and especially lower income countries that allow them space to exploit near-term emitting resources. So I think this is a very exciting and promising initiative. The one other point I'd make on this, just to avoid coming back again, is I'm struck across this debate by the lack of complete quantification in estimates. And I see that everywhere. Several times folks have referred to the IPCC as kind of the gold standard in identifying the scale and importance of CDR in reasonably risk-limiting trajectories. I'm astonished by how deep you have to dig inside the IPCC reports in order to find numbers that say when a net emission number is reported as the top line, how much emissions balanced against how much removals are differenced in creating that net number. In the headline scenarios and all the summaries, you just can't find it. The trajectories are of net emissions to the point of net zero and net removals beyond there. There's zero information about the scale of residual emissions that are allowed to offset against ongoing removals, either before or after the net zero point. And it's crucial. There are differences among the underlying scenarios of factors of 10 in the scale of gross removals required under different scenarios. And this vast uncertainty, I mean, it's big under any scenario, but the vast uncertainty over how big, how fast is this huge, invisible elephant in the room. So
I was just applauding that. It's driven me mad. I've searched and searched trying to find that. And also when you do find it, they tend to say carbon sinks without making a distinction between where the carbon actually came from. And so is it a CCS or is it actually a carbon removal? And also any cumulative amount only goes through to 2100, which is neither use nor ornament, as my mum used to say. And so I really support that. And I think we desperately need that science to be done. And I can't find it out there.
I had to chase down one of the chapter lead authors to get him to say, yep, it's really as hard to find and as concealed as you think it is.
Yeah, I agree. And it can breed cynicism, right? If we're talking about this as a residual response for hard to abate sectors, and we can't quantify that or aren't trying to and establishing metrics, right, for how we're going to hold companies' feet to the fire, right? It's going to breed
back to
cynicism.
the Stocktake text, the meaning of unabated versus abated.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So one other question I had, Katie, right? Now the cynic in me says you look at a place like Panama that's claiming to be net negative with huge amounts of that coming from forests, and Finland perhaps going the same route. Given the fact that many people believe that, because of issues of evanescence, some driven by climate change, or the very bigger question of permanence, right, of forest-based sequestration, is this really going to be a meaningful commitment of net negative if it's driven largely by planting trees?
Yeah, I mean, I think it won't. I think it'll, as I said, of course, it will be different by country. Not all countries will be relying on that, and I think it will. I think this discussion will have to play out within the initiative itself in terms of how it sets itself up and what the goals are and what the targets are and what counts for different countries. So I think that will definitely evolve over time. So I don't really have a great answer there. I guess it can also kind of get into the like for like discussion. If you have more biogenic emissions, can you offset them or counterbalance them with biogenic based carbon removal and vice versa? And so I think part of this will have to be countries identifying what their emission sources are and what are suitable options to counterbalance residual emissions at net zero and after net zero, and what the portfolio looks like, both on the emission side and the carbon removal side, based on emission sources and based on other national circumstances. So I think the short answer is a lot of that will still need to be worked out. within how the initiative sets itself up and governs itself.
All right. Okay, let's get into some audience questions. First question from Joe Murray. I think this would probably be for you primarily, Ben. Can you expand more on how all of the standards are trying to work together to cement a unified quality threshold, such as VCMI, SBTI, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the key thing to follow on track there will be to see how the spectrum of different standards bodies are able to come together to have a common definition of what that means. And so there's a lot of different groups out there that you had just mentioned too well with VCMI, the announcement that was made between some of the major registries and some of the specific registries that are focused right now on carbon removal only. And so how are we reaching alignment on standards around monitoring, reporting, and verification, and how does that harmony take place? I think first it's worth tracking and following the conversations that take place within the different efforts that are moving right now, but then ultimately, how do we see where do we see points of commonality across them as we're trying to foster cohesion in the overall market? So I think it's definitely areas to track and follow there as some of the different areas are taking place, and as we see different announcements or documents coming out for public review. Definitely an opportunity for folks an area to keep an eye on, and an opportunity for folks to engage in the new year.
Okay, Gabrielle.
I wanted to separate out some of the announcements that were actually made. So in looking at how to get integrity back into this market, the carbon market 2.0, all of that, what the standards need to look like, who was getting together. So there was this big announcement, and it was made by what I might characterize as the big four. So that's the VCMI, the ICVCM, the SBTI, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And they all have different roles. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol setting out what actually, how you divide your emissions up into the different scopes and what's allowed in terms of that accounting. The SBTI actually setting out this is what good looks like. This is if you actually have a reduction target which fits their overall plan, and you have interim targets that they can ratify. The VCMI, which says this is what good corporate action looks like, and this is what you should be allowed to buy, and this is what you should have to do. And the ICVCM, which is saying what a good credit looks like. And the ICVCM bringing out its core carbon principles to say this is what a good credit looks like. Now, part of the issue has been, although various members of one of these are on the boards of others and so on, they haven't really coordinated amongst themselves to have a kind of have a soup to nuts version of what this should all look like, from when the credit's generated all the way through to when it's bought and retired by a corporate. And so I think that announcement was saying that they're going to make a bigger effort to coordinate on the whole journey, what the whole thing needs to look like. And then separately, there were various standards who got together saying, okay, like your Verra and your gold standards saying we're going to coordinate too. I think this is brilliant. I think it's utterly necessary. It's relevant to carbon removals, but not massively so at the moment, because carbon removals are such a small part of the voluntary market and aren't really being explicitly considered in any of those rule setters at the moment. Not really in any of them. They're mentioned in the net zero standard for the SBTI, but you're only supposed to worry about that when you get to your net zero, and nobody else is really explicitly talking about removals as yet. But also, I don't think they've really thought out what that coordination and what that collaboration is going to look like. It's a sort of declaration of intent apart from anything else. But I think it's a really important start. They do need to be coordinating more. And we really do need to have removals more explicitly in the mix, because as Ted and Ben already said, removals have different characteristics and different prices and different needs, and we're trying to build an industry more quickly out of nothing. And so I think that's a lot of the work we're doing at Rethinking Removals actually involves having those conversations.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think in the long term, that's going to be the lion's share of the voluntary carbon market. But yeah, we got to get to it. Okay, another question from Vanessa Schweitzer. Isn't the huge range in how much CDR is needed due to scenario uncertainty? In the next 25 years, if the majority of the world embraces a US lifestyle, emissions will be much higher than if it embraces a European lifestyle. Maybe you, Ted, since you kicked over this apple cart.
Yeah, of course. And hi, Vanessa. Thanks for joining. Yeah, of course, it's scenario uncertainty. I mean, the faster emissions come down, then the smaller the cumulative removals necessary to achieve any given target. But of course, that how fast emissions come down embeds a combination of behavioral and technological issues. So I don't know whether in saying scenarios you meant to highlight the sort of the large scale behavioral and value choices as opposed to the technological choices. I mean, my view is that what drives the wide disparity in the implied scale of removals needed by what time in order to achieve targets is aggregate progress on emissions through whatever combination of rapid technological change or behavioral change. And of course, you know, the mechanisms and the implications of those two are different, but in the final analysis, it's the total emissions line that counts for this purpose.
Okay. All right. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's not an easy one. So we'll end with this from Jennifer Gerhold. What is your view of the most plausible outcome we can expect around Article 6, particularly 6.4 at COP29? Because we'll be back here next year talking about this invariably. Any thoughts?
I thought it was going to go through in COP28, so I'm the last person to ask.
Yeah.
And who knows? I think, you know, one thing I'd say about this is you can't predict the future, but you can help create it. And I think we probably need to do a lot more work this year. And we're not the only ones. I mean, I don't think the negotiators came out thinking, well, we covered ourselves in glory there. So, you know, I think there's clearly a lot more work to be done. And if the work gets done, we've got a fighting chance of getting it back through again.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good way to end it. Plenty more things to look at in the year ahead. And so I really want to thank, first of all, our panelists for their really thoughtful interventions, Katie, Ben, Ted, and Gabrielle, and obviously our audience in terms of their questions and helping us further this discussion. So happy holidays to everybody. Thank you for joining us as you have during the year. I hope you'll continue to join us. We'll have 2 webinars in January, which we'll announce very soon. And with that, I will close out Scrubbing the Skies for 2023. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye, and thank you all.
Thanks.